Thomas Starling Sullivant was one of the most innovative and talented comic illustrators in America, but I'm betting that apart from a few hardcore comic enthusiasts, not many viewers will be familiar with his work. Sullivan was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1854. In 1872, when he was 18, he sailed to Europe, where he lived mainly in Germany for several years. What he did there doesn't seem to have been recorded, and the trail vanishes until 1885, when he enrolled at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, by which time he was already 31. A year later, his first published cartoons appeared in the humour magazine Truth. More tellingly for his career, in 1887, his work appeared in the biggest selling and most influential humour magazine of the time, Puck. And this raised his profile considerably, and soon enough he was getting commissions from other prestigious national publications, such as Harper's Weekly and Life magazine. His relationship with Life would last for his entire career. Modestly considering himself to be a work in progress, he continued to study, first with the painter Edward Moran, and then illustrator E.B. Bensall, noted for his pen and ink drawings and wood engravings. Whether it was due to this tuition or his own development, Sullivan quickly evolved into one of the most gifted pen and ink comic artists of that or any other time. By the turn of the century, he had added Judge magazine to his list of clients, and Judge was rapidly overtaking Puck as the leading American humour magazine. In 1904, he signed a contract to draw political cartoons for the publisher William Randolph Hearst, which he did for the next 3 years. When the contract ran out in 1907, he sailed off to Europe again and returned to America in 1911, where he resumed his association with Life magazine and stuck with them almost exclusively up to his death. Sullivan was unquestionably a master of pen and ink illustration, and very few colour examples of his work exist. Those that do are basic washes of watercolour over the hatching and modelling created by his always descriptive line. Other than this curious indifference to what colour might bring to his work, Sullivan never stopped experimenting with distorted anatomy, perspective and posing throughout his career. Many of his characters sported greatly enlarged heads, and although he wasn't the first to employ this technique, he was one of its more accomplished practitioners. Some sources assert that Sullivan used Edward Muybridge's photographic studies of human and animal movement as reference for a lot of his images. This can't be proven, but it might go some way to explain his uncanny observational skills. As he got older, he struggled to stay relevant in a rapidly evolving market, but he still managed a career of 40 or so years, up to his death in 1926 at the age of 72. In addition to being an immensely talented and distinctive illustrator, Norman Lindsay was also a successful painter, sculptor and writer. And although I'm not getting involved with his writing or sculpture, I'm going to have to include some of his painted art with the illustration, simply because it's too good to leave out. He was born in Creswick, Victoria in 1879, the fifth of 10 children, and at the age of 16 he moved to Melbourne to work with his older brother Lionel as an illustrator for a local magazine. 4 years later, in 1899, Lindsay made his freelance debut with a series of pen and ink drawings for an edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, which was well received, if not exactly a bestseller. In 1901, he and Lionel moved to the Blue Mountains region, just west of Sydney, where he was employed as a staff artist for the Sydney Bulletin. This professional association would last for 50 years and provide a steady income, while Lindsay pushed at the accepted boundaries of decency in his other work. And his painting in particular did just that, with rampant nudity and an obvious delight in the sins of the flesh. He was remarkably adept with both oils and watercolour, and he used both with great visual energy and control. Sex would also feature in his illustration, but to a lesser extent, and usually rendered in pen and ink, which he also wielded with consummate skill. From early in his career, a lot of his work was condemned as both blasphemous and obscene, and he would remain a controversial figure throughout his adult life. At this time, Lindsay was travelling extensively in Europe, but he still found time to create a 100-picture set of drawings for Petronius's Satyricon. This collection of mostly erotic tales from 1st century Rome was decidedly not meant for family reading, and it succeeded in fanning the flames of his reputation. He returned to Australia in 1911, but he fell ill with pleurisy, and his pace of work slowed dramatically for a few years. Nevertheless, he continued to pursue all aspects of his creativity, and the erotic was rarely off his agenda. In the Great War, he produced patriotic propaganda for king and country, both in his illustrations for the bulletin and some stirring posters to aid recruitment and build morale. And he wrote and illustrated the children's book The Magic Pudding, which was published in 1918. This surreal story featured charming, lively pen drawings of an endearing and strange collection of characters, and it was an immediate popular and critical success, and is still in print in Australia a century later. By the 1920s, Lindsay was focusing less on his illustration work and was painting and writing novels most of the time, several of which also got banned by the censors, much to Lindsay's annoyance. But he returned to more expected adult material with a series of pen drawings for Aristophanes' Lysistrata in 1926. His work for the Bulletin continued to bring in a regular income, and despite his clashes with the censors elsewhere, these images were unmolested. In 1936, another children's novel, The Flyaway Highway, was published, featuring Lindsay's light humorous pen drawings throughout the book. And if that wasn't enough, he continued to be immensely prolific, producing many etchings, watercolours, oil painting and sculpture. In 1940, Lindsay took 16 crates of his work to the USA in the hope they would be protected from damage in the war. But with terrible irony, they were seized by American customs officials, branded as pornography and burned. In later life, Lindsay abandoned illustration altogether, but continued to create his controversial art right up to his death in 1969 at the age of 90. In the case of French illustrator Maurice Pepin, I find myself once again attempting to profile an illustrator about whom absolutely nothing is known. Decent resolution images are also in quite short supply, but Pepin is high on my list of favourite illustrators, so I'll have to give it my best shot. He was born somewhere in France, sometime around 1890, and as nothing is recorded, we don't know where, if anywhere, he learned to paint and draw. The earliest dated examples of his work I can find are from 1917, at which point he would have already been 27, so it's probable that he had been working before that, but it's just speculation on my part. Initially, his illustrations were published using his actual name in both La Serie and Fantasio magazine. But of the two, it was La Serie which gave him the vast majority of his commissions, and after 1920, the evidence is that his work appeared exclusively in their pages, so it's likely that he was by now employed as a staff artist rather than as an occasional freelancer. But that's more speculation. And predictably, the more he worked, the more his illustration style grew into a particularly agreeable combination of delicate controlled ink line and watercolour washes. By now he had adopted the alias Pem and used it to sign all his work for the rest of his career. Everything he created for La Serie was printed as duotone, and although this was done to keep costs down, the limitations of the method actually added visual appeal to all his images. It seems the only time Pepin worked in full colour was with his series of racy postcard pin-ups. But it's the work he created for La Serie and the comical, frequently farcical suggestion of a narrative which were his most visually engaging and entertaining pictures, and the absence of full colour was no loss at all. The trail of images runs out again around 1932, and between then and his death in 1940, at the age of 50, there is another unaccounted for period. Why an artist as talented and popular as Pepin has been so poorly remembered is puzzling, to say the very least. And if there's anyone out there who knows more about him and his work, please let me know. American cartoonist Abner Dean was born Abner Epstein in 1910 in New York. Why he changed his name is unknown, and unfortunately so is much of his life. Ironically, quite a bit's been written about the intellectual and existential qualities of his work, but hardly anything resembling biographical information or insight into his working methods. We know that in 1931 Dean studied at the National Academy of Design, but the rest will have to be pieced together from his dates of publication. In the early 30s, Dean created several line and wash colour covers for the New Yorker magazine, a remarkably prestigious series of commissions for a newcomer. This association appears to have lasted only a couple of years, after which point his cartoons started to feature regularly in the pages of the recently launched Esquire magazine. And in this collection of fairly cheerful conventional series of gags, there's little indication of the darker humour to come. His first book of drawings was It's a Long Way to Heaven, published in 1945, and it was now clear that he was making little to no attempt to put sugar on the neurotic pill of his images. The book met with critical success, but more surprisingly it was also popular with the public, who bought it in large numbers. And on the back of that success he hastily put together another titled What Am I Doing Here? And that sold well when published in 1947. Both these books and much of what followed was staunchly monochrome, and his characters appear naked, although devoid of genitals, as they wander through a disturbing barren urban landscape. In 1950, Life magazine commissioned Dean to illustrate a particularly lengthy article in the magazine, which was about the recent publication of George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984. But the results only exposed a significant gulf between the nature of the book and Dean's comic styling. His collision with the world of advertising was far more creatively and unexpectedly successful. In the 1950s, he was asked to illustrate a long-running ad campaign, which appeared as a series of press ads to sell insurance. And Dean's superficially light-hearted but underlying neurotic visuals were a perfect fit for the psychological assault being waged on the American public by the denizens of Madison Avenue. Even so, he was at his happiest, if you can call it that, when creating his own books and expressing his own thoughts. And he published several more up to his last book, which was not far from the jungle in 1956. The odd thing is, at the time of the book's publication, Dean himself was only 46 years old, and he didn't meet his maker until 1982. So what he did in the unaccounted for quarter of a century, and why he stopped writing, we'll never know. And on that frustrating note, we come to the end of another video. I hope you got something out of it, and there'll be more in a couple of weeks. Thanks for watching.